Hello and welcome to Let's Pod This. My name is Andy Moore. It's good to be with you again this week. Folks, we are literally at the end of the legislative session. They're not going to be done officially until next Friday, until the 27th, which is when they are constitutionally required to adjourn a sine die. But as we record this at around 3 o'clock on Friday, it is widely expected that the legislature will adjourn to the call of the chair today, which means they don't have to come back next week unless they need to. And that need to could be because the governor vetoes the budget or any number of other bills that they want to come back and override. So today's episode is going to be all about the budget. Both Scott and Bailey are out of town, which leaves you with me and one illustrious guest, Emma Morris, who is the Healthcare and Revenue Policy Analyst for the Oklahoma Policy Institute. Emma, welcome back to the show.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
We're excited for you to be here and talk about the budget. It is, I believe, one of, if not the largest state budgets in history for Oklahoma.
Yes.
Is it actually the largest or just like really close to it?
So when we look at nominal dollars, which means unadjusted for things like inflation, this is the largest budget that we've seen in state history. However, that doesn't necessarily tell the entire economic story of a state and its budget and what it can afford. So when we adjust for things like inflation and for population growth, we're still, we have more this year than we have in the last about decade, but we're still below levels that we saw in the early 2000s.
Right. I'm really glad you made that point. And this was on purpose because we see headlines as, we see press releases or comments from members of the legislature that say, this is the largest budget in state history. And it's like, well, there's an asterisk after that, or there should be, because nominal dollars is not the best way to measure the actual size or the functional size of a budget over time, right? That's
right.
I may, if you make, $20,000 and then 10 years later you get a raise to $25,000, you're making more money, but it's arguably paying for going not as far, right? Like everything else costs more. All of these things go up. That's the way it works.
Exactly. And it works the exact same with the state budget and what our state can spend, right? So if you think about, let's say, public education, they have a certain amount of money every year to spend. But if their appropriation doesn't increase at the rate of inflation every year, then they're, effectively getting a budget cut. Because as the things that public schools pay for to provide public schooling to our children, as the cost of those things increase, our state budget should theoretically increase with those costs to help cover the additional costs, but that's not always, not even usually the case in Oklahoma.
Yeah, I mean, I think often we hear, that, it was a flat budget. Everyone was held flat, and that is effectively a decrease, right? If your pay was held flat year after year, that's feels like a pay cut, right? Like
right. You can buy less than you could the year before.
That's right. And with the inflation that we are currently experiencing, which is not expected to last forever, and in fact, there's a strong argument that we're reaching peak inflation. The people feel it. In fact, I saw a little while ago that the average price per gallon of gas is expected to hit $6 in August. Now, I don't remember who expected this. It's probably some bank, but if that's the case, to compare that to the minimum wage, which is $7.25, it's like, so I can work a whole hour for 1 gallon of gas. That's not a way to run a country, you might say.
Right. Definitely not a good way to run the state budget, for sure.
That's right. Yeah. Well, let's kind of dig in a little bit to the budget this year. I want to ask you about some specific highlights of things we've heard a lot about in the news or that we've talked about here on this program. But before we get into some of those, could you give us kind of a 30,000 foot view of how this budget stacks up against previous years and maybe where Oklahomans might feel or notice increases, decreases, how those kind of shifts?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll start by saying that a lot of what we've been hearing from legislators or in the news is that we have a budget of about $9.8 billion. But that just accounts for the general appropriations bill. So if we really want to think about the state budget as a whole, we should think about what they're appropriating money to outside of just that general appropriations bill. So when we account for the general appropriations as well as for several incentive programs, and things of that nature that the legislature introduced as a part of the budget and is in the process of passing, then the total budget is actually about $10.9 billion. So it's a little bit larger than what we might be hearing in the news. As I said earlier, we always adjust that number for population growth and for inflation. And so with our $10.9 billion budget this year, we're sitting at about 11%. This year's budget is about 11% smaller than the year 2000 when we adjust for those things. And as we talked about, we adjust for those things to really help us see the full picture of the economic and fiscal picture in Oklahoma. So this year's budget is definitely larger than it has been in the past few years, but we are still sort of seeing a decline from where we used to be in the early 2000s.
So 11% smaller than it was 22 years ago. Is that what I heard you say? That's that's substantial. That means we're having to do a whole lot more with a lot less money. And that's
Exactly.
really difficult. Yeah.
Yeah, and I will say that, a few years ago, our state budget was closer to 25% smaller than it was in the year 2000. So we have made a lot of gains, partly because of, revenue packages that the revenue package that the legislature passed in 2018, because of, all this pandemic money that's flowing around the economy. But so there's several different reasons, but we are doing better this year than we have in recent years.
But I know that just on one data point alone, right? The population of our state grew 5 to 7% in the last decade, right? To say nothing about the decade before that. And so to know that we have more people in our state and we're spending less money means that we've had to make some significant cuts to some state services. Now, I guess people could argue that we only cut those that were, waste, fraud, and abuse, things we didn't really need that government shouldn't do. But that's not really how it ever plays out, right? Like, I rarely see them say, okay, this agency just can go away entirely. They tend to kind of just tamp down on multiple categories or multiple agencies or everybody, as we saw the last 5 years ago. Like, they really did across the board cuts to every agency, and so that ends up where we are now, 11% down over 20 years. But that is, as you said, a little higher than it was like 5 years ago when things were really dire, I think, in our state.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely right. We're definitely in a better position than we were about 5 years ago. I will say that just because we're in a better position than 5 years ago doesn't mean that we're adequately or fully funding our state services. I think it's easy to forget sometimes that the services that our state provides really benefit every single one of us, right? We always think about, public education. So many of our kids in Oklahoma are being educated by public schools. The Department of Transportation makes sure that our roads are drivable. So these agencies that are being appropriated funds through the state budget, they really do impact every single one of us, no matter our income, where we live, what our background is. So it's just something to keep in mind when we're talking about this money, right? Because it's the money of the people of Oklahoma. And when we pool that tax money together and we invest in Oklahomans, we're all feeling those benefits.
Speaking of money that we pay in, one of the aspects of this year's budget negotiations was a payment back to Oklahomans. Where did that end up? What's the status of that?
Yeah, so as part of the budget agreement, legislators are proposing a bill that would basically give $75 to Oklahomans who file any income tax return. So $75 for single filers and $150 for married filers. That's going to cost the state about $181 million. When we went into session, there was a lot of talk about permanently cutting personal income tax, which would have really caused long-term harm to the state's ability to fund those services we were just talking about. And so a one-time tax rebate is, going to be a little bit better for the state in the short term and the long term, because we're not going to see long-term revenue decline because of this one-time rebate. However, I do think it's necessary to point out that this rebate goes to anyone who files an income tax regardless of income. And so, you think about someone making $10,000 a year, that $75 is going to go a long way. Someone making $100,000 a year, that $75 isn't going to make a big difference, right, in their lives and their everyday happenings. And so it's just the legislature could have done something a little bit more targeted, maybe towards just the lower and middle class Oklahomans, maybe increase those payments a little bit, really targeted towards the people who are feeling the burden of inflation, right, and who are seeing their buying power be withered away. And so, the $75 payment is better than fully or permanently cutting the income tax, but there are definitely ways that we could have improved that in order to really make a difference in the lives of Oklahomans.
Yeah, I mean, that's when it comes out to a couple of tanks of gas, right? Or groceries or some groceries. Not the price of groceries is high, so you can get some groceries for a week. And I think everyone is appreciative of having more money in their pocket, but the the magic of a diversified tax base is that everybody pays in, and that money is then pooled and can go a long way together, right? So while it's only $75 to you or to me, on for the state in aggregate, you said it was $181 million. So that's like 3,000 teachers we could have hired, right? Like there's a flip side to this, that if we give the money back, it means that we can't, as a state, spend it on things that we need.
Right, exactly. Yeah. When we pull that money together, it goes so much further than $75 goes for one person. There are a lot of Oklahomans who will use that $75 and who need that $75, right? But in the spirit of easing inflation and truly helping Oklahomans, a more targeted rebate, maybe a one-time expansion of the earned income tax credit or something like that, would have gone a lot further towards achieving the goal of using that one-time money for a one-time payment, but actually helping people who could really use it.
Right. Yeah, because this also means that Harold Hamm gets $75 back, and I don't think he needs it. I don't know his finances intimately, but I'm pretty certain he doesn't need that $75 and won't even notice because it's not him that does his taxes. Yeah. Well, another item that was garnered a lot of attention and discussion this year was some sort of elimination of the grocery sales tax, the state sales tax on groceries, or some kind of credit to help offset the cost of it. And I think the last time you were on the show, we talked about this. What happened with that?
Great question. Yes, there was a lot of discussion about this session, with some people saying let's cut the state sales tax completely, others saying let's cut the entire sales tax on groceries completely, and then others saying that we should keep the tax but create or expand an existing credit to sort of offset the cost of that tax for low-income Oklahomans. Providing that tax relief through the credit would have provided that more targeted tax relief. As you were saying earlier, fully eliminating the state sales tax on groceries would have meant people like Harold Hamm were not paying sales tax on groceries. Offsetting that cost with the tax credit would have meant that people who can afford to pay that tax are still paying it. But people who are struggling to make ends meet and to pay that tax would have been able to offset the cost with the credit. But The debate at this point didn't cross the finish line, because as part of the budget negotiation, there was no movement on the grocery sales tax or the credit. I imagine it will continue to be a discussion for the next few years. I know lawmakers on both sides of the aisle have expressed public interest about figuring out how to make that system work a little bit better for Oklahomans. So I imagine it will continue to be a discussion that's had by a lot of people. But this year, we likely aren't going to see any changes to that tax, at least not in the budget negotiation that they've currently laid out.
Yeah. So maybe let's look at some of the agencies. Now, I know you have a giant spreadsheet with all this data. Are there any like big winners or big losers that you think are worth highlighting? I think the Department of Health got a pretty big bump this year, which they certainly
Yes, I'm scrolling through my big spreadsheet that you discussed. It looks like Health Department got about a 4% increase,
which is a small percentage, but that's a lot of money because they're a big agency.
Right. Yeah. So there definitely were some investments that the legislators are going to be making this year. I think one of the biggest ones, and the one that a lot of folks have probably seen in the news, is an increase of $32.5 million to the Department of Human Services, specifically to eliminate the waiting list for Oklahomans with developmental disabilities. So I'm sure your listeners probably know there are hundreds of Oklahomans who are currently waiting for services that will help them live everyday lives, Oklahomans with developmental disabilities. And some of those individuals have been waiting 13 years for services. Fixing this issue has been on the priority list for a lot of legislators for a long time. And finally, this year, it looks like that might be at least closer to a reality. So as I said, there's $32.5 million. The legislators are directing that be used to provide services to more people, as well as provide a 25% rate increase for the providers who actually provide those services, those assistance services. And so hopefully this means that we'll finally be able to get those hundreds, I think it's about 500 Oklahomans, the services that they've been waiting so long for. There are several other agencies that got some investments, although the size of, we'll talk about the Department of Mental Health real quick.
Yeah.
The size of their increase is about 6% over last year. And the legislature also specified that they have, that the Department of Mental Health should use some of this increase for certain reasons. So there are a couple that really stood out to me, one being about $2 million to expand services for kids with acute behavioral health needs. So in discussing this provision, Senator Thompson talked about how there are often kids who spend the night in emergency rooms or similar while they're waiting for mental health inpatient treatment. And so this will hopefully help mitigate some of those issues. Mental health also got a $500,000 amount, I guess, that they are going to use to run pilot programs in county jails where they will provide individuals with medication-assisted treatment as they're trying to confront and treat substance abuse. And so those are just a few examples of things. We have extra money this year. And so legislators in some areas really did choose to make those targeted investments, which are going to honestly pay dividends for Oklahomans as we're able to live healthier and more robust lives because of some of these things.
Yeah. I saw that the Attorney General's office also got an additional, I don't know the additional, but their appropriation was $32 million this year, which is pretty significant. I think it's a pretty big bump. We knew that there was a bill to give them like an extra $10 million to fight federal government overreach. But it's somewhat awkward, I think, that it came out this week because also earlier this week on Wednesday, the 18th, KOSU had a story that highlighted that Oklahoma, the state, paid outside counsel, so a different attorney's office, double the fees for arguing the McGirt case, and it came out to like 1.4 million. And so I know I had a number of attorneys who texted me and said, "Holy moly, that got paid 1.4 million dollars for doing basically like one filing and an oral argument." And it was they had originally been contracted for like 700,000, and they added on an additional supplement for that. And so when we see a big appropriation like the 32 million the AG's office is getting, I mean, it's pretty well known that this money is supposed to go towards funding these type of efforts. The state is trying to, in their minds, push back against federal overreach, I guess was what they explicitly said. But again, this means that that money is not going towards other state services that could benefit from it. Do you happen to have in front of you, Emma, like how much the AG's office got last year? So because I don't know what the
yeah, I actually do. So for fiscal year 22, the AG's office, gotta make sure I'm looking at the right number, got about 26 million. And there's actually another bill that's part of the budget sort of package that would give another 5.3 to the AG, bringing them to 38 this year. So that is about a 46% increase over last year. If that second bill ultimately passes as part of the budget agreement. So yeah, a really significant increase. And as you said, they have stated that it is to fight, quote, federal overreach, which, could be anything from McGirt to anything else they decide is worth suing about.
That's right. As a reminder, listeners, the Oklahoma Attorney General is an elected position, and there will be a very important primary election between 2 or 3 Republicans in June 28th. And then the winner of that, well, if there's a runoff, it'll be in August. But whoever the Republican nominee, I think faces, a libertarian in the general election in November. So anyway, if this is something you care about, listeners, don't forget you actually get to vote for who the AG is, and that person gets to decide how they spend the money. Or if they give it back, I guess that's an option. They could not spend it and give it back to the state for reappropriation somewhere else. That doesn't ever happen though. Once you get the money, you find ways to spend it. All right. Well, Emma, I know one other thing that's been pretty widely discussed this session, is what's called Project Ocean, which is, I think we all know now, like that's the incentive money that the governor asked to be set aside to entice Panasonic or some other unnamed company to move to Oklahoma or invest in Oklahoma. Specifically, Panasonic is looking at building a battery factory, but they, kind of hinted there could be others out there. And when that bill passed to authorize that several weeks ago, the thing that I heard from everybody was that kind of took the wind out of the sails of a lot of these other tax credit, rebate, discount things, right? They're like, oh, well, if we're going to give $700 million to this, then we can't afford to eliminate the corporate income tax or those things. Did that actually play out that way? In your observations, your estimate, did the energy and the money that went towards Project Ocean end up kind of cutting the other things out of the negotiations?
Yeah, so I don't know what lawmakers were thinking in their heads as they were I don't know what their reasoning was about why or why not to ultimately cut taxes. I will say that as a part of the budget negotiation, there was nothing. There was no corporate income tax cut. There was no throughout session there had been a lot of talk about also eliminating what's called the franchise tax, and to my knowledge, I don't believe that was a part of the budget deal either. And so I think, there was a lot of discussion about if lawmakers can spend 700 million on a corporation, they can also spend, increased investments or targeted investments in Oklahomans, the people who live here, especially the people who are maybe struggling a little bit to get by or who are needing a little bit more assistance. And so I heard a lot of conversations about that and about people sort of seeing that as an opportunity to talk about the need for not only things like economic development, but also investing in development of the people who live here. So as I said, I don't know what lawmakers were thinking, but I do think that that was sort of some of the calculus behind those decisions.
That's such an interesting way to frame it too. Like, and with the disability waiting list, right? If we are going to invest that much money to address a need we know exists, imagine what other kind of moonshot projects we could do on behalf of the people of our state that aren't necessarily like going to help a corporation who is for profit and generates lots of money already. There's other ways that money could be spent. There's a lot that goes into it. I get that, but just for a mental exercise, everyone, imagine what the state could do with $700 million to help people. And in fact, I will mention this. We'll probably come back to it, but that money that's being spent on Project Ocean is supposed to be or it is part of the call for a special session that the legislature made this week. They're running a concurrent special session to address two things: the federal American Rescue Plan money, or ARPA money, that the state has received but not yet spent, as well as that Project Ocean funding. And I guess from what it sounds like is that they recognize that Panasonic may not choose us. And then what happens to that money? So I think they want to come back and say, okay, we're going to come back and devise a plan for how to spend that money to benefit Oklahomans, presumably. I guess they could come back and say they're going to cut corporate income tax or something instead, but they'll come back in the coming weeks, like next week, and then coming months to review that. And who knows? We'll see what happens. But I think they're doing this special session now, one, so they can pass the budget, send it to the governor so that he has time to review it and either sign it or veto it, right? And if if they send him the budget and then they adjourn sine die today, that means the governor has 15 days to sign, veto, or take no action. But if they don't adjourn sine die today, if they just adjourn to the call of the chair, he only has 5 days, which means he has to act on it by next Thursday. That's the 26th. And I know there's lots of discussions about whether or not he will, but uh, and we don't, as you said, we don't know what's in their heads. But let's say he does. Emma, what happens if the governor vetoes the budget? Does the state just go broke? Does everything shut down for a few weeks?
Let's hope not. So if the governor does veto the budget, which, as you said, we don't know what's in his head, but it doesn't necessarily reflect what he said he wanted at the beginning of session in his State of the State. So that we'll sort of just wait and see what he does with that. But if they do end up vetoing it, or if he does end up vetoing it, basically legislators would be able to come back, as you said, at the call of the chair and override that veto if they feel strongly enough about it. I believe it's 3/4 majority to override a veto, and so could be 2/3. It's a strong majority though, and so they may, I think in past years, have had the numbers to override a veto, and so theoretically they would come back, do that, and then we would go on as normal.
He can also line item veto things in the budget too, right?
I think so. Yes, I have not been around, or at least working on the budget when he has done that. I don't think so. I don't know exactly what the procedure is if he does something like that.
That's interesting. I can think of it. I know that it's occurred a few times, and I can't, of course, on right now on the spot think of what those were. But where the governor just like said, "Okay, no, not this, no, not that," like, and they were pretty smaller amounts, like a few million. That's we just toss it around, a few $1 million here or there. But I think then that money just stays in the general revenue fund and either rolls over to the next year, or in some cases, I don't know, we get hit by a global pandemic and are suddenly out of cash. Those things happen.
Yeah, no, that actually reminds me. I believe that Representative Wallace, when he was discussing the budget today, I believe he said, even with all of this money appropriated, we still have about $504 million in cash, basically, sitting in the general revenue fund. So I assume if the governor vetoed a line item, vetoed something, it would just sort of go into that pot of 504.
Does that, because the only money that goes into like the rainy day fund, they have to specifically appropriate into that fund.
So I believe that when the Board of Equalization certifies the revenue estimates for a coming fiscal year, there's a certain percent that, if certified by the board, it just goes directly in. So they typically don't appropriate to the general revenue or the revenue stabilization. I think they can, but I think most of the time it is automatic. They can and do appropriate to the Rate Preservation Fund, which is our third savings account in Oklahoma, which is used to sort of help balance out Medicaid provider rates whenever federal matching dollars change. And they made a few appropriations to that fund in this bill this year.
How interesting. Well, as you were talking, I remembered that we have now multiple rainy day funds, essentially. And I'm curious how some of those are performing based on projections from 3 or 4 years ago when they were proposed. In fact, I believe that Oklahoma City Mayor Holt, when he was a senator, was the author of one of those bills. Um, I'd be curious to see how that's playing out. I mean, the goal of all of them, I think, was to provide stabilization to revenue. So hopefully that's helped. Although it's been a bit of a bumpy ride the last couple of years that was not expected when they passed those bills.
Yeah, I think that throughout session, several times it's been said we have record or close to record amounts in our savings account. When the Board of Equalization certified this year's revenues, I believe they said we have the fourth largest savings account in the nation. So it appears that we've been pretty good at saving. I think the question is, how much do we get to, right? We have, by the end of this year, I think we're projected to have over $2 billion. And so the question is, like, when do we stop saving and start spending on some of those things we've talked about, right?
Yeah, it's been tough. When Governor Stitt was elected, one of his pledges was to increase the state's savings account because which was also one of Governor Fallon's pledges. And because when she took office, I think she says they had like $2.17 or something. It was a very small amount in the rainy day fund. And then it grew. They made some policy changes and it grew very big. But then we had an economic downturn and some bad fiscal policy, and all of that got erased really quickly, right? And I think this is something we all relate to, man. Just when you think you're getting ahead, some unexpected expense comes through, car accident, kid breaks his arm, whatever, and like whoosh, all that money you saved for months is like gone in a heartbeat. So that's what happened. So then Governor Stitt took office and started at the bottom, right? And then pretty quickly, because times had changed, we were having some pretty good economic success, grew that up to what was then, I think, the largest rainy day fund we'd had in state history. But then, boom, again, pandemic hit, and we had to spend some of that money. And since then, we've had this huge influx of federal funds to help cover a lot of things, right? And there was lots of discussion and some lawsuits about whether or not states could use federal funding to supplant their existing funding. And I think what happened, and is, I guess, arguably still happening, as more COVID money is still filtering in through ARPA and other things, that a lot of the stuff that's the money that we would have spent on infrastructure or on just operations was indeed supplanted or like filled in by federal funds. And that's made it a little more stable on the state ends. Uh, the question then is what happens when this federal money runs out once we spend it on this stuff, and we don't even know where all it might go with the ARPA funds because the way it is now, the governor's office or the administration is in charge of spending it. They solicited They put out a call for proposals or request for proposals and received, I don't know, $200 million worth of requests or something, and or $200 billion of requests, and they only have like 1.7 billion to spend, and they haven't funded it, and so that's why the legislature is calling this special session to go in and review them. There's a lawsuit, I think, from Non-Doc or Oklahoma Watch, to try to get the list of requests released, because we don't know who requested what, um, and that seems like a pretty normal thing to request. So we'll see over the next several months if that information comes out, and who the legislature decides to recommend that money be spent on.
Yeah, no, the ARPA money is it's gonna be really interesting to watch and see what they do. So it's in Oklahoma right now. We have sort of our general revenue fund that is currently being appropriated, and then we also have our American Rescue Plan Act funds, or the ARPA funds. In some states, they have just appropriated those as part of the state budget. In Oklahoma, our state leaders opted to sort of use two separate processes to go about our general appropriations like normal, which allows outside observers to sort of see how our general appropriations compare to previous and future years. But they do have this opportunity with the ARPA dollars to identify those maybe one time, or maybe so maybe one-time needs, or maybe needs that we can invest in now and then see the payoff in a few years whenever that federal money is gone. They have the opportunity to identify those things, and then with all this money, hopefully actually invest in them. And so, as you said, they will likely use a special session for that. And so I think that's definitely something to watch, just to see, because our state does have a lot of needs. I think all of your listeners could probably identify at least a few, and so this is just a really good opportunity for the state to identify those and invest in them, and hopefully lawmakers will see it that way as well.
Yeah. And the ARPA money isn't just at the state level, it's at the county and the municipal level as well. And I'm willing to bet that some of the requests that the state received were from cities and counties who said, hey, listen, we're not getting as much money as you, but could we partner together on this deal? We'll put in 10 million and you put in 10 million, and we can build a really nice park or a road or, senior center. I don't know. I'm just making up things. I haven't seen any of these requests. And Emma, were there any other surprises in the budget this year that you want to address?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest ones that a lot of folks are talking about, and that stood out to me as well, is the State Department of Education got a relatively small increase in their budget compared to most other agencies. So the Department of Education ended up only getting a 0.5% increase. And so that's little, if any, new money going into the funding formula. As I said earlier on the podcast, when we don't increase agency budgets at the rate of inflation, agencies are seeing cuts in what they're able to buy. And so with, amidst large and possibly record inflation, I'm not an economist, so I can't necessarily speak to that. But when we're living in this time of inflation, to only give our State Department of Education a 0.5% increase is going to impact their buying power next year, is going to impact what they can and can't do for our students next year. And so, especially as we're leaving, $500 million in cash, as we're spending $700 million on a company that might be Panasonic, as we have appropriated $250 million towards rural incentives this year. I think it was a surprise for a lot of folks that the State Department of Education, and by extension our public schools, didn't also see a pretty big investment.
Listeners, you may have noticed that we've talked about the budget only today and not about all of the other social bills that have come through the legislature this week. That's by design, one, because this is when Emma could join us, and two, because it's still happening. And I know for a lot of our listeners and a lot of folks, it's still pretty fresh, and we're still really, I think, sorting out and beginning to understand exactly what the implications of some of these bills will be. Most notably, I think we've passed now the fourth quote total ban on abortion this session. And I was on a call earlier today with a bunch of organizations, both from in Oklahoma and nationally, who were really trying to wrestle with the language about what does this mean for emergency contraception, like the morning after pill. What does it mean for IUDs? What does it mean for all of this stuff? Lots of questions up in the air, and so we're gonna press pause on that, and we will try to bring it back to you as soon as we can. The hard part about that is that some of these had an emergency clause on them, which means they're effective right away, and it's and difficult to you know difficult to talk about legislation that is immediately in force when even those minds and legal scholars and people who work on these policies professionally haven't had a chance to really explore or understand what they mean. So that stuff's coming. I'm just a little disclaimer there. Um, Emma, as we kind of wrap up, I think the budget talks. Um, how can listeners, I don't know, assess if this is a good budget? What are the things that listeners could be looking for as we see headlines about state spending, as we see, shifts between agencies that are happening, Service Oklahoma becoming a huge department in the OMES agency, those things. Are there ways that regular folks can kind of say, yeah, my state's spending money in a good way, or I think I disagree. They're misspending the money somehow.
Yes, that's a great question. And I have several thoughts on that. So I'll just take through a list here. So every year after the budget comes out, usually around June, OK Policy will release our budget highlights post. And so it'll have lots of different and very wonky, nerdy graphs that you might find interesting. And then we'll sort of tick through each of the subcommittees. So what agencies are getting more, what are getting less. And so for listeners that are really interested in those nitty gritty details, look out for that. For everyone, honestly, whenever we pass the budget as a state, it's often done pretty quickly. It's often done behind closed doors. It's often hard for members of the public to be engaged in the process. For example, this year, the budget bills were released on Monday at 6 p.m. And I believe all of the major ones have passed out of the House and the Senate as of today. And so that's, 4 business days for people who are working, for people who are busy. I know it's May, everyone's kids are doing everything. It's really hard to look at a budget bill and analyze what it means in 4 days on top of your regular jobs and activities. And so I think one of the things is lawmakers need to hear that you want to know what's going on with the budget. They need to hear that members of the public care and are interested and have thoughts on how we spend our money. And so anything that people can do to communicate that or to ask questions to their legislator is really important. And then the last thing is that government manifests in our lives every day. We don't often think about it, right? But when we drive on a road, the quality of that road is a reflection of what the government is doing. What your child is learning at school is a reflection of how we're investing our money in public education. And so think about and try to notice those things. If you're waiting in a really long line at DPS for a driver's license, that's a manifestation of government, right? So sometimes it's good, sometimes it's bad. But anything that we as members of the public can do to identify those things and to identify those issues or those successes that government is having and doing, and then elevate those, I think is really important. So just observing what's going on, observing, oh, my wait at DPS this year is faster or slower than last year, or my kid is really loving school this year and is learning so much. I think we forget about those things sometimes, but that really is like a direct reflection of how well our government is running. So observing those things, keeping track of those things and communicating those things, I think is really important.
It's so funny that you use that as the example, because one of my friends who is a listener to the show sent me a text message today of a photo of the line they got to a tag agency before it opened this morning. There was a line, and it took them 4 hours to get in to get someone's driver's license or whatever they needed. And they were frustrated, and they were like, "Isn't this like a government funded thing? Tag agencies are private businesses, but they provide a state service." And I think this person obviously knows that one of the big shifts that is going to happen is that tag agencies are going to take on more responsibility for government activities with this new Service Oklahoma department. And so it's just funny that you said that. I was like, I literally saw a picture of people waiting in line at our state's version of the DPS office, right?
Yeah, and with Service Oklahoma, they're hoping to mitigate that, right? So we should be able to witness that happening, and that's a great representation of what tax dollars together means lower or shorter wait times at DPS or tag agency or whatever. So yeah, just keeping an eye out for that, I think, is really important.
One can only hope. I do think it's important. I mean, to remember that just because you have a good or bad experience doesn't mean that that's necessarily translatable. I think it's easy for us to examine our own experience, and we should, and say, "Oh, well, this is good, or this is not good, or this could use some work." But things we highlighted, right? Like we highlighted that the education budget was mostly flat. Well, that's probably not great given where it's been. But the disability waiting list is hopefully going away, right? They got a big influx of money that should allow for them to at least meet the needs of people who are currently on the waiting list. And that's good. If that happens, that is tremendous. But there's everything with a budget, whether it's your personal budget, the state budget, is a give and take. We all like spending money on fun things and not on, utilities or bad things or whatever bills. Golly, I think I got a insurance healthcare related bill in the mail today. That's never fun, right? That's always way too much money. And so, listeners, as you, I guess, go about your life over the next year, stay tuned. We'll certainly share OK Policy's budget information as we always do, so that you can kind of have a better, more educated perspective on what this budget looks like, especially because it came out of the shadows so quickly and got passed so quickly, as it does almost every year. But then maybe pay attention more. This is an election year. Everyone who helped craft this budget is, if they're running for office again, they're on the ballot, and there's an opportunity for you to reflect your preference, your approval or your disapproval of them in that way. And that also means, regardless of voting, they're going to be campaigning. People are going to be knocking doors, participating in candidate forums, meet and greets, all of these things. And it gives you, Oklahoma voter, the opportunity to talk to them, to build a relationship, to introduce yourself to them and say, hey, I'm a constituent and I really appreciate your vote on this bill, or I really did not appreciate your vote on this bill. Or if you watched any of the debate on the floor this week, good golly, there were just some really difficult, hurtful things said, that I just kept thinking after watching some of this, that like, if these were on the screen during the evening news, a whole lot of these legislators would have to answer some big questions and probably be embarrassed, right, to see their own words being shown back to them. I think it's easy to say things in that building with that mindset, that people honestly may not feel or didn't intend it that way, and it's still, that's what we have to live with, and it's harmful. Okay, well, I'm on a soapbox. I'm going to get off of that. Listeners, that brings us to the end of this episode. Emma Morris from OK Policy, thank you so much for being here today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Don't forget, the deadline to register to vote for the June primary is June 3rd. That's in 2 weeks. That means you need to check your registration, make sure that you're still on the rolls. Go to elections.ok.gov, log into the voter tool to do that, and then ask around. Talk to your friends, your family. Ask them if they are registered to vote. We can start there. People will say, I think so. Tell them to go check, right? If you've moved recently, if you haven't voted in a while, there's a good chance you might not be there. In fact, I met someone last week who moved and was still registered at their old address, and it had been a number of years, I think more than 10 years since they voted, and the registration had been marked as invalid because they hadn't used it in that long. Don't let that be you. Go do it. Go register. You can get a registration online. You can print it. You can go to any tag agency. Hopefully you don't have to wait 4 hours to get it. A lot of post offices have them too, but honestly, you can just go to the election board and print it off. That's a great way to do it. Okay, on that note, as we say every week, decisions are made by those who show up. And this is a year that we all have a chance to show up. Have a good week.